Learn daily. JustProfessor here. A machine gives you a reward 70% of the time when you press the left button and 30% when you press the right button. You know these numbers. The smart move is obvious. Press left every single time. But you won't do that. Your brain will make you press right sometimes, and you'll win less money because of it. Your brain sees patterns in random events that don't actually exist. When something happens 70% of the time and something else happens 30% of the time, you think the smart strategy is to match those probabilities with your choices. Choose the first option 70% of the time and the second option 30% of the time. It feels like you're being strategic and adaptive. You're not. You're throwing away wins by trying to predict randomness. This mistake is called probability matching, and it's costing you money, opportunities, and correct predictions every single day. Probability matching is when you match the frequency of your choices to the probability of outcomes, instead of always choosing the option with the highest probability. If something works 70% of the time, the optimal strategy is to pick it 100% of the time. But people don't do this. They pick it 70% of the time and pick the worse option 30% of the time. They're trying to match the pattern they see in the outcomes. The problem is, this strategy is objectively worse. If option A works 70% of the time and option B works 30% of the time, you maximize your wins by always choosing A. You'll be right 70% of the time. But if you probability match and choose A 70% and B 30%, your success rate drops. When you pick A, you're right 70% of those times. When you pick B, you're right 30% of those times. Your overall success rate becomes around 58%. You win less by trying to be clever about matching probabilities. This happens because your brain is a pattern-finding machine. When you see that something happens 70-30, your brain assumes there's an underlying pattern to when each outcome occurs. It thinks if you can figure out the pattern, you can predict which outcome will happen next. So you start varying your choices, trying to match what you think the pattern is. But if the outcomes are random, there is no pattern. Your attempts to find one just make you pick the worse option more often than you should. Probability matching reveals a deep confusion about randomness. People understand that something can happen 70% of the time, but they don't act like it. They act like there's a hidden sequence they can decode. They think being right 70% of the time means they should vary their strategy. They don't understand that being right 70% of the time when outcomes are random means doing the same thing every single time, and accepting you'll be wrong 30% through no fault of your own. Let me show you how probability matching makes you perform worse while feeling smarter. The classic experiment uses a simple prediction task. A light appears on the left or right. It appears on the left 70% of the time completely randomly. You're told these probabilities. Your job is to predict where the light will appear as many times as possible. The optimal strategy is brain-dead simple. Always predict left. You'll be correct 70% of the time. But that's not what people do. They predict left about 70% of the time and right about 30%. They're trying to match the probability distribution. They think they're being strategic. They're actually being stupid. Their success rate drops to around 58% when they could have 70% just by being boring and predictable. Animals in the same experiment do better than humans. Rats learn to always pick the high probability option. Humans are too clever for their own good. Gambling shows probability matching destroying people's money. Slot machines pay out at different rates. One machine pays 30% of the time. Another pays 70%. You'd think people would camp on the 70% machine. Some do. But many people rotate between machines. They play the good machine for a while, then switch to the bad machine, then back. They're probability matching. They see that both machines pay out sometimes and they want to catch both patterns. They're losing money by playing the worst machine at all when they could just stay on the better one. Sports betting involves constant probability matching. A bettor knows a certain type of bet wins 60% of the time. The smart move is to always make that bet. But they don't. They make that bet 60% of the time and make worse bets the other 40% because they're trying to diversify or catch different opportunities. They think they're being sophisticated. They're reducing their win rate by not sticking with what works best. Stock trading shows probability matching and strategy switching. An investor finds an approach that works 70% of the time. Instead of sticking with it, they use it 70% of the time and use other approaches the rest of the time. They're trying to match different market conditions or catch different opportunities. But if the first approach has the highest success rate, every trade using a different approach is probably a losing trade they didn't need to make. They'd win more by being consistent and boring. Job searching demonstrates probability matching and application strategies. Someone learns that applications with referrals succeed 40% of the time, while cold applications succeed 5%. The optimal strategy is to only apply through referrals until that option is exhausted. But people don't do this. They send some applications with referrals and lots of cold applications. They're probability matching the overall job market where both types of applications exist. They're wasting time on low-probability applications when they could focus entirely on the high-probability approach. Dating involves probability matching too. Someone realizes that dates from a particular source work out well 30% of the time, while dates from another source work out 5%. They should focus entirely on the first source, but they split their time between both. They're matching the probability distribution of where they could potentially find dates rather than maximizing the probability of success. They go on more bad dates than necessary. Studying shows students probability matching with learning methods. A student discovers that practice problems improve their test scores much more than reading the textbook. The smart approach is to spend almost all study time on practice problems. But students split their time. They read for a while, do problems for a while, read some more. They're matching what they think a good study session looks like rather than maximizing what actually works. They learn less efficiently. Medical treatment can involve probability matching by doctors. A treatment works 80% of the time. Another treatment works 40%. The first treatment should always be tried first. But sometimes doctors vary their approach. They use the best treatment most of the time and try alternatives occasionally. They're matching their behavior to the existence of multiple options rather than always choosing the option with the best probability. Patients get suboptimal treatment. Product development teams probability match with features. Data shows one type of feature drives user engagement much more than others. The team should focus on that type. But they build a mix of feature types. They're matching the variety of possible features rather than focusing on what has the highest probability of success. The product improves slower than it could. So how do you stop probability matching when your brain is wired to find patterns in randomness? How do you stick with what works best instead of trying to be clever? First, understand that maximizing is different from matching. If option A is best, you maximize by always choosing A. You don't match by choosing A proportionally to how much better it is. The goal is to win most, not to mirror the probability distribution. Second, accept that randomness means you can't predict individual outcomes. When something works 70% of the time randomly, there's no pattern to when it works versus when it doesn't. Your brain will tell you there might be a pattern. There isn't. Always choosing the high probability option is the best you can do. Third, resist the urge to vary your strategy when it feels repetitive. Probability matching happens partly because always doing the same thing feels wrong. It feels like you're not adapting or being strategic. But when probabilities are stable, adaptation means sticking with what works best. Boring consistency beats clever variation. Fourth, remember that you'll be wrong sometimes even with the best strategy. If something works 70%, it fails 30%. That doesn't mean you should switch strategies. It means randomness has variance. Accept the failures that come from doing the optimal thing rather than trying to avoid them by switching to worse options. Fifth, calculate your actual success rate with different strategies. When you feel tempted to split your choices, do the math. Always choosing the best option gives you its success rate. Splitting between options gives you a weighted average that's always worse. The numbers don't lie, even when your intuition does. Sixth, identify when you're probability matching in your own behavior. Look for situations where you know what works best, but you're not doing it consistently. You're probably varying your approach to match perceived patterns. Stop varying and start maximizing. Seventh, trust simple strategies over complex ones when probabilities are clear. Probability matching feels sophisticated because you're adapting to multiple options. But when one option is clearly better, the sophisticated strategy is the boring one. Always pick the winner. Probability matching is when you match the frequency of your choices to the probability distribution of outcomes instead of always choosing the highest probability option. If something works 70% of the time, you pick it 70% instead of 100%. This feels strategic. It's actually stupid. You're lowering your success rate by trying to mirror probabilities instead of maximize them. This happens because your brain looks for patterns in randomness. When outcomes occur at 70-30, your brain thinks there's a hidden pattern to when each happens. It tries to predict which outcome comes next by varying your choices. But if outcomes are random, there is no pattern. Your variation just makes you pick the worse option more than you should. The math is simple. Always choosing the option that works 70% gives you a 70% success rate. Choosing that option 70% of the time and the worse option 30% gives you about 58% success. You lose 12 percentage points by trying to be clever. This applies to everything from gambling to investing, to career choices to relationships. Anytime you split your choices to match probability distributions instead of maximizing the best option, you're throwing away wins. Fighting probability matching means accepting that the optimal strategy is often boring and repetitive. It means always doing what works best even when it feels too simple. It means accepting that you'll fail sometimes with the best strategy because of randomness, not because you should switch strategies. It means trusting math over intuition when your brain says there might be a pattern to exploit. Your brain will keep trying to find patterns in random outcomes. That's what it does. But you can recognize when you're probability matching and force yourself to maximize instead. Stop varying your approach to match how often different outcomes occur. Start consistently choosing the approach with the highest probability of success. You'll win more by being simple and boring than by being clever and varied. Subscribe to discover more ways randomness is fooling your brain.